Thank you. Well, welcome to today's presentation from West Pasco Audubon. We're really glad that you can join with us for this event. This is a very important day for us because this is the culmination of what we've been working on for probably a couple of years now, and particularly the research that took place starting on August 1st of last year and ending on the 31st of this year. So maybe the next slide, Caitlin. Yeah, so just a note, I think muting yourself, we are able to do that for most people, but if you are by any chance coming to us by phone, it's important that you mute yourself because we cannot mute you, and that can be distracting if you're in a car. We'd love to have your questions. And after this presentation, Pat Goldberg is going to be moderating the panel discussion and the Q&A, but it will help her if you type some questions in the bottom, especially to get us going afterwards. We're looking forward to those questions. And they could be addressed either to a specific individual or to the panel as a whole. Okay, Caitlin? Okay, so in order to do the research that we did, we needed a place to do it from. And what you will see on this current slide on the top left is the spot that we wanted to use to view the species. But at that point, this was very hard to reach. You'll see there was the Girl Scout, what we call the Girl Scout picnic table, but you couldn't get there. Actually, it was Boy Scouts, I think. You couldn't get there for 10 months of the year because of the water depth. So you couldn't get there on the deer path, and behind it was saw palmetto, and it was really thick. I remember the first time I went out there with the warden at that time, Rick. He took a machete to make a path through to get us through there. So you'll see at the top right, you'll see our Peter Day is there at the initial meeting where he was able to get this wonderful architect, Ed Hoffman, who's the person on the right there, to volunteer his time and efforts to develop a blind. So you'll see Ed created the image you see on the bottom left there, the original drawing of the bird blind. And we are so eternally grateful to Ed for everything he did to make this possible. He worked very hard on the design. And you'll see on the right, that is the real thing. That's the actual photograph of what he created. And this blind made this study possible. And I'd like to say here, this blind was built by a veteran-owned and operated company, Ameridox, locally. And the only way we could make all of this happen was with the very generous grant that we received from Duke Energy Foundation. Is Jeff Baker on the call right now? Is Jeff here? Because if Jeff would like to say a few words, I'm not sure if he is. I know he was planning to join us. Are you able to see if Jeff's with us, Peter?
I don't see him among the participants.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, maybe he was unable to make it. But if you could roll us to the next slide. This is, Casey Cumley from Swiftmud brought his drone to do some photography for us and show us what was really out there over the lake. And you'll see in the bottom center of your screen, that's the bird blind right here. That lake is about 100 acres, I understand. It is very long. It's, I think it was half a mile to the back of it. And the blind being here allowed us to see what was over here and about back here and over here. But there's a vast area that we really could not see very well, even with the blind. But without the blind, we could have seen far less. So this was really a critical part of our efforts. And we could also never have done this study without Caitlin. Caitlin really stepped in very early. I was looking for a partner to help us do this study. I'm not a scientist. I didn't quite know how to go about it. I had some ideas, but Caitlin just took it and ran with it. She developed the study design. She used her expertise to provide the maps and the mapping for the projects. She wrote the reports, and she has written this presentation today. And I just want to commend her for her excellent leadership in this area. We're so glad to have you with us and for everything you've done. And with that, I will hand it over to Caitlin. We can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
It's one of those, Zoom things that you just have to deal with every now and again where you muted and then unmuted. But all right, now I can say hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this presentation. This project has meant so much to me, and it has been a cornerstone of my development as a professional scientist. I want to thank Christine for allowing me to take the lead and create the result that we have today. And I also wanted to give a special thank you to Christine and Mitch Dormont, who kindly provided us with almost all of the photos in the slideshow today. I will be presenting alongside the panel of study volunteers to discuss the effects of seasonality and water level on the use of Grassy Lake, which is a basin marsh, by 7 of Florida's threatened species. This will be a more general overview of the project and some of the findings, and I'm saving the deep, in-depth analysis for the final report. So if anyone is curious about reading the report, it'll be available on the West Pasco Audubon Society website within the next few months. So before I get into the data, I want to provide some information about Grassy Lake. Grassy Lake is an isolated basin marsh located in the J.B. Starkey Wilderness Preserve. It is roughly, Christine said 100, it's about roughly 91 acres based on aerial photography measurements in the GIS program. It is in a shallow isolated depression, so the name basin. And as a marsh, it is semi-permanently flooded with a majority of herbaceous, so non-woody stemmed plants. I have listed some of the more common plants and trees in this slide. Grassy Lake is also considered an augmented wetland because in times of heavy rain, surface water from the Pithliscoti River is pumped into the wetland to reduce flooding in Pasco County. The wetland can only be augmented up to a maximum level of 30.3 feet. And last year, the hydro period of the wetland, which is the amount of standing water in the wetland at a certain time, was 365 days. So that means there was water in the wetland year-round, even though there were water level fluctuations. Many bird species besides the birds we studied are also in the wetland, like songbirds, raptors, including the occasional bald eagle, owls, wading birds, and diving ducks. Peter will be discussing this a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And other animals like white-tailed deer and their fawns, alligators, frogs, fish, turtles, and insects also use this wetland, so it is a productive ecosystem. So as citizen scientists, we were interested to see if there was a trend for habitat use when it was compared to seasonality and water depth, or water level, I should say. We don't know the exact depths of the lake, although we do know it is very shallow. The focal species are shown here, next to a photo actually of the interior of the blind. All of the species designated as threatened in Florida, so studying their habitats and habits and behaviors is critical to understanding how we can help with their conservation. So as a disclaimer, ecological studies like this will never be perfectly controlled, and we had to work within the parameters that were set for us by nature. We controlled for as many factors as we could, but we were limited by difference in bird surveying experience and equipment, lack of complete wetland visibility, and partial subjectivity of bird observations. So as such, please consider this study as a very conservative estimate of bird activity in the wetland. However, it is important because it establishes a blueprint for more robust studies in the future while also giving a glimpse into how the habitat is used. It can also be used as an educational tool for local school systems, which Ricky will touch on at the end of the presentation. So just one quick note, and you will be seeing these words a lot and hearing these words a lot, is that the term survey is just the monitoring session when we observed the birds. So each time we went out there and sat for a while, it was the survey. And the term sighting refers to the instance that a bird or a grouping of birds was recorded. For our methods, we surveyed Grassy Lake at least 5 days a week for a period of at least 30 minutes within 2 hours of sunrise. This was to try and capture the birds when they were most actively foraging in the wetland, which would be about sunrise. The wetland was monitored for 302 out of a possible 365 days, which is about an 83% coverage. And the average survey time was about 56 minutes in total. We spent approximately 280 hours in total sitting at the blind between all of the study volunteers, if you can imagine that. So when we surveyed, we recorded variables like temperature, wind speed and direction, rain, cloud cover, the start time, the length of the visit, and the water level. For the bird observations, we recorded the species sighted, the number of birds sighted per grouping if there were multiple birds in a sighting, the location of the sighting, the predominant bird behavior, and then some additional comments as we saw fit. We recorded the birds by visual observations with equipment like binoculars and spotting scopes if it were available. And each sighting was only counted once per survey, even if the bird or a group of birds changed position. And also because the birds were not banded, the total counts of the species represent overall visits to the site and do not indicate that a new and unique bird was recorded with each sighting. So birds coming back and using the blind for multiple times is more likely. When we cited our focal species, we recorded the bird's primary behavior. The list of behaviors to choose from was perched, preening/sunning, vocalizing, foraging, and flying with and without wetland use. Preference was given to what I call wetland occupying behaviors, such as perching, preening, sunning, and foraging, to try and get a clear picture of how the wetland was being used, if it was even being used at all. For example, if a bird was first noticed flying into the study site, but then it landed to forage, we listed the primary behavior as foraging. And if a bird was seen flying into or out of the site, but not physically seen in the wetland due to some of the thick vegetation, we still counted it a wetland use and labeled it flying with use because we could determine based on, I guess, the angle of attack where the birds were flying, or if we saw them flying out of a space or flying into a space, then not being able to see their behaviors from then on. So yes, that was counted as wetland use and labeled flying with use. If the bird flew over the site without stopping in at the wetland, it was considered flying without use. We also created a vocalization only category specific to sandhill cranes because we often heard them in the wetland without visual confirmation. We were careful to take very conservative estimates of the amount of sandhill cranes in the wetland if they were only identified by their vocalizations. And normally in bird surveying, you can identify birds based on their vocalization only. To record the location of the birds we saw, I designed a grid over an aerial photo of Grassy Lake and divided it into 15 separate sections to keep track of the birds as we spotted them. The sections aren't equal in size due to the irregular shape of the wetland. Nature is a very cool designer, but unfortunately, nature doesn't design things conveniently for scientific studies. There was also no physical markers that we could install to differentiate the sections due to the managed status of the wetland and the fact that this was a volunteer study. So we used pre-existing structures like vegetation, such as dead trees and duck boxes that are installed on the lake or wetland, and the staff gauge poles that were previously installed to monitor the levels to tell the sections apart. The bird blind is located in this little recreation icon right here at the top of the wetland, and the center line is marked in red. The location of the water gauge is there, right at just a little yellow marker. And the red outline is a rough interpretation of the visible area from the blind, which was about 35% of the wetland. So there's still a significant blind spot, but we made do with what we could. Water levels were recorded and provided by Pasco County Public Works. They were measured in feet NAVD, which is the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. It's based on mean sea level elevation surveys. And so each little tick mark on the staff gauge represents 1/10 of a foot instead of inches of a foot. The data was recorded by the Pasco County Technicians Daily from the small staff gauge located right next to the surface water discharge point, which was where that little yellow dot was on the previous slide. Unfortunately, though, the gauge was limited to a minimum level of 28.4 feet before the water levels dropped below it and it became unreadable to anybody. The graph here shows the water level throughout our project as the blue line, and the bottom measurement of the hydraulic gauge is in the red line, just to show sort of the times when the water level could not be read and dipped below that. One thing to consider is that the 2021 dry season was significantly drier than the previous years. The total recorded rainfall was about 15 inches compared to around 23 inches in 2019 and 2020, as provided by the Southwest Florida Water Management District rainfall estimates for Pasco County. I just need to do this. Okay. So we'll start with my personal favorite, which is the sandhill crane. So the label sandhill crane was applied to both the threatened Pratensis subspecies, which is the non-migratory sandhill crane, the Florida sandhill crane, and the Tabita subspecies, which is the migratory sandhill crane. This is because the subspecies could not be determined accurately without a direct side-by-side comparison of the two, and naturally birds don't line up for photos for us, so we have to make do with what we have. In general, there was no trend for sandhill crane sightings when compared to water levels. However, there was a possible trend for these sightings and behavior when compared to season. It's highly likely that migratory sandhill cranes were using Grassy Lake as their wintering grounds. And it was also confirmed that the threatened non-migratory Florida sandhill cranes utilized the wetland. And it was confirmed that it was used as a nesting site for them. The total amount of sandhill crane sightings was 1,044. From supplemental database comments, it appeared that the cranes roosted in the wetland and foraged in the morning, and then left the wetland after sunrise, possibly in search of improved pastures during the day. So here's the graph of the average number of sandhill crane sightings per survey when compared to the different water levels and their associated behaviors. So remember that survey is each bird monitoring session, and sighting is just the bird or grouping of birds that was recorded. The vertical axis is the average number of sightings, and the horizontal axis is the water level. So to create this graph, I averaged the number of days the water level was recorded for each type of sighting, as shown in the bottom legend. So wetland occupying behavior, specifically sandhill cranes, there is vocalization only, and then non-occupying behavior. If I were to just put up the raw data in the graph, it would have been skewed to the below hydraulic gauge interval because there were 82 days where the levels were below this gauge versus some intervals where there are only a few days. So it would have looked a little something like this. I wanted to try and give a true sense of the wetland use because for some of the sightings, the cranes simply flew overhead without stopping into the wetland. Although it was assumed that almost all the cranes were using the lake when they were vocalizing, their exact location couldn't be pinpointed. So I couldn't use it or include it with the lake occupying behaviors. However, I did color the category a light blue to differentiate it from just complete lake or wetland non-use. Based off of our findings, there appears to be no trend between the water level and the sandhill crane sightings. Since some water levels were observed more than others, it's possible but unlikely that a trend would show more data. And this is true for all of our study species. And let me break down what's going on here as well. So this graph demonstrates the average number of sandhill crane sightings per survey and their behaviors, then broken down by the season. The vertical axis is the number of sightings, and the horizontal axis is the season. Again, they're split into the different behaviors and separated by color. Overall, the average crane sightings increased from fall to winter, then decreased from winter to summer. Based on percentages, wetland occupation was lowest in the winter at 52%, not including the vocalizations, and spring at 58%, while vocalizations increased. Also in the winter of 2020, there was an increase in non-occupying behavior from the sandhill cranes at about 17% of all the behaviors for that season. This could be due to the migratory cranes flying to and from their wintering grounds without stopping in at Grassy Lake. But again, I cannot say for sure. So during the breeding months in the spring, we kept an eye out for the possibility of nesting cranes by closely observing their behaviors. In one instance, there was a display of extreme territoriality where two cranes chased and bit the single crane that had landed in the section A1. And the single crane actually had a gash on its leg from the encounter, the poor thing. The pair was seen in previous sessions flattening grasses and sitting down, but although they never successfully produced a colt. And there was a pair of cranes that frequented sections B1 and B2 that successfully produced a colt. The first sighting was April 4th, 2021, so a cool Easter surprise for Christine. And the colt right here was seen and estimated to be about 3 to 4 weeks old. We saw the family throughout the remainder of our visits until the study ended in July. So now we move on to the next species, which is the little blue heron. The bird on this slide is a juvenile, so his feathers haven't fully turned blue yet. There was no observed breeding and nesting by little blue herons, although we did see use of the wetland by flighted juveniles like the one on the previous slide. Sighting number and behaviors vary by season, and also sighting number by water level appeared to vary slightly. In total, there were about 357 sightings of little blue herons. So here's the graph for the water levels. Based on the graph, it's possible that there may be a slight trend for deeper levels because of the cluster of readings right here. However, with only a year's worth of data and without a more in-depth statistical analysis, it's impossible to know if this is the little blue heron's true preference. Multiple factors can be at play, like seasonality, because the highest water levels occurred in the fall where they were seen most frequently. And speaking of seasonality, here is the seasonal graph. The most little blue heron sightings occurred in the fall, then it sharply decreased in the winter and leveled out in the spring and the summer. And when taking behavior into account, the highest wetland occupancy occurred in the fall, and the most flying without use occurred in the winter and spring months. In the winter, the non-use was about 77%, and in the spring it was about 71%, while in the fall it was about 26% and about 29% in the summer. So there was a clear trend, which I speculate is due to some sort of seasonality. Also, one thing to note is that there are numbers below one sighting per survey, and that is because there were surveys where no little blue herons were seen, so it lowered the average. Next, we move on to the tricolored heron, and I'll give you a second to appreciate this photogenic little guy. A photo courtesy of Mitch Dormont. Oh, either Mitch or Christine. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. I think it might have actually been Christine. So while there was no observed breeding and nesting by tricolored herons, there was also no obvious trend for sightings when compared to water level. However, the sighting number and behaviors did vary a little bit by season, and there were 183 sightings in total. Here's the water level graph again. The number of sightings per survey are mostly less than 1, and in some cases even less than 0.5. And this is because tricolored herons were more uncommon than little blue herons. There appears to be no trend between the water level and sightings based on the limited data that was gathered. And here's the seasonal graph. Much like the little blue heron, the tricolored heron also had a lower amount of sightings in the winter and spring. The percentages of wetland occupying behavior in the winter and spring also decreased, although the contrast isn't nearly as large as with the little blue heron. However, this graph is a little misleading when trying to compare the frequency of behaviors due to these small numbers. So I can tell you that in the winter, non-occupying behavior was at 32%, and in the spring it was 25%, compared to the fall number, which was 9.52%, and the summer, which was 4.81%. So there was some seasonal variation in sighting frequency and behavior per season. Now we can talk about the wood stork. As demonstrated in this photo, it's encouraging to see that the wood storks are actually using the wetland to forage successfully, because they do have specific conditions that they need and certain densities of prey in order to stop in. There was no observed breeding and nesting by wood storks. The sighting number varied by both water level and season, but there was no trend for observed behaviors. There were 75 total sightings, so the data was a little bit more sparse. Here's the water level graph. Although there was not a lot of data gathered, it does appear that there is a slight trend for lower water levels. Like I said before, wood storks do require that certain density of prey to forage successfully, so we could speculate that the lower water levels could assist in this process. But like I mentioned earlier, I can't draw any definitive conclusions because seasonality could also be a factor, and the lower water levels do align with the spring and summer months. Here's the seasonal graph. Again, with the average sightings per survey on the horizontal axis and season on the vertical. Oh shoot, I might have flip-flopped those, but the vertical axis is the average sightings per survey and the horizontal axis is the season. Sorry about that. The presence of wood storks increased from the fall to the summer, but there was no trend in behavior when comparing the percentages for the frequency of behavior. There was a total of 2 sightings in the fall, 10 sightings in the winter, 27 sightings in the spring, and 36 sightings in the summer. So now we get to talk about one of the most visually striking visitors to Grassy Lake, which is the roseate spoonbill. So there was no observed breeding or nesting for the spoonbills. Sighting number did vary slightly by season, as did behavior, and there was no observable trend for water level. Like the wood stork, there were very few sightings of roseate spoonbills. There were 28 sightings for the entire study. So Grassy Lake is at the very edge of the spoonbill's native range, so this finding wasn't too surprising. Here's my water level graph. I had to reduce the scale a little bit to make the data more visible. I kept the scales generally the same for the other birds except for the sandhill crane because there were a lot more sandhill cranes. So there's no observable trend, especially because the data is a little bit too lacking for me to speculate. But here's the seasonal graph. And it does show that there was a little bit of variation by the seasons. Again, the numbers are very small. So note that the roseate spoonbill we saw did not use the wetland in the spring. So it's just completely orange with non-occupying behavior. And the sightings did increase slightly from the length of fall to the summer. And here's our American kestrel. And note that I didn't say southeastern American kestrel, and I will explain why. Kestrels were observed consistently from October 8th, 2020 to February 26th, 2021. and there was one kestrel flyover in May. Because almost all of the sightings occurred in the late fall to early spring, it is highly likely that the kestrels that we saw during that time period were the northern subspecies and not the threatened southeastern subspecies. During the times when we observed them, they were almost always perched on trees, either in the middle of the cypress dome or out in the outer fringes. So we considered that wetland occupation. The dominant behavior was perching, although they occasionally preened for short amount of time. There were solitary sightings, except for one occasion where two birds were very close to each other in the trees, and 50 kestrels were observed in total. But because they never actually foraged in the wetland and only appeared consistently within the certain time frame of the late fall to early spring, I didn't include any water level or seasonality comparison graphs. And lastly, we have the least tern. We didn't have any least tern sightings, unfortunately, and they are highly uncommon to be seen on Grassy Lake in general. They're primarily shorebirds, but they do roost and nest on rooftops. So we were wondering if any of them were flying over or flying by, if they were nesting on any of the rooftops nearby. So to sum up, what did we see? Do we get seasonality? Do we get water level, or both? Ideally, to support a hypothesis, a study like this would span multiple years to account for natural fluctuations in the environment over the seasons and differing annual rainfall amounts. So in essence, while there was no way for us to untangle the possible relationship between the birds, the water level, and the seasons, all the birds displayed some sort of seasonal variation, either to their behaviors or to the number of sightings. So we can say that there may be some seasonality at play. The water level didn't appear to produce many strong trends that stood apart from the seasonal variation, but as is true in all ecological systems, these variables are interconnected in a way where both factors can play off of each other, although one variable can be a stronger influence than the other. So now I want to give the floor to Peter Day to speak about some of the non-study species that were seen on Grassy Lake through the cataloging app eBird. And then Ricky will talk about his experience as a study volunteer and also touch on the future considerations of this project and the bird blind itself.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful session and presented so well. Thank you, Kate. I want to say a bit about eBird, which is a system for recording birds that was launched in 2002 by the Cornell Bird Lab. Those of you who've never used eBird need to look at it. It provides some extremely interesting statistics, and the Grassy Lake bird population is certainly well featured there. The first recording of a bird on Grassy Lake on eBird was in April of last year by Christine, who reported 10 species. I was checking on Thursday evening, by which time a total of 528 checklists had been entered in eBird for Grassy Lake, and 120 different species reported, 69 of them with photographs. One interesting point, no audio recordings yet. So any of you interested in recording birdsong, bear that in mind. It's a gap in our data. Next slide, please. One of the most common birds on Grassy Lake is the anhinga. You see them drying their feathers after hunting underwater. And the interesting thing about Grassy Lake is the variety of birds, 120 species seen, But what are they doing? I can only give you the barest glimpse now, but the next slide will show you what the anhinga does. It spears fish, tosses them up in the air, and swallows them head first, which is a very interesting thing to watch because they often don't catch them the right way down the first time. Next slide. Another fearless underwater hunter is the pied-billed grebe, an innocent-looking little bird, but as you can see, it can certainly eat its body weight. We occasionally see osprey, but I've never seen any hunting on the lake. Another source of food are the water lily pads, and it's amusing to see red-winged blackbirds turning over the edges of the leaves, eating insects and other water animals on the undersides. Boat-tailed grackles have the same, do the same thing. Here are two purple gallinules. They have very long toes. They're fascinating birds, and it was wonderful to see them. They bred in 1950. We had 2 chicks raised. I think only 1 survived, but you can see the characteristic blue patch on their heads, have long red bills with a yellow tip, which shows in this photograph. And talking of breeding, black-bellied whistling ducks, here are 9 young birds photographed from the blind with an iPhone, and not a very good camera. My last slide shows you that you can also meet other birders at the blind. And this is Joe Hubbard, birder friend of ours, who's well known. And I've shown Joe's picture because Joe introduced us to Ed, the architect who designed the blind and made it such a wonderful resource for us. Thank you.
Hello all, thank you very much for being a part of the presentation, and thank you to Caitlin and Christine for hosting this. And I just wanted to share with you all some monitoring survey experiences that I think could be beneficial to understand for the community. So my first point is there's really no substitutes for wildlife monitoring. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that there's really no other, and from my perspective, there's no better way to learn and engage with the landscape that you are studying. So we can see the difference in the seasonality and how wildlife and other species interact within the habitat. So that definitely comes into ecology-wise, seeing different species interact with one another is quite amazing, especially with the bird species, and seeing symbiosis within those surveying opportunities is very valuable. And yeah, that's definitely linked with species behavior as well. And it's my argument that wildlife monitoring and surveying opportunities can be a great tool for environmental education and also environmental protection. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, moving forward with our threatened bird species study, West Pasco has been in discussions with Pasco County Schools And we had a meeting early 2020 and with talks with Leslie Kirkley and Mark Butler, who both work with Pasco County Schools, to see how the bird blind can be utilized within the local community, and to really engage students in the data that we have presented today. And hopefully there are future discussions concerning those areas. But we're looking forward to the bird blind hopefully being a part of environmental education within the community, and also how this threatened bird species study can further spark experiences for generations to come. So thank you very much for being a part of the presentation.
Okay, great. Well, we officially have 10 minutes left. Peter, is it okay if we go a little longer if there's a need?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I don't see any questions addressed in general to the chat box. If you have any, please go ahead and type them. Did any of the panel members get one specifically targeted to them? I'm guessing no. Okay.
We now have one in the chat box.
Yep.
That-
So let's see. Olivia asked, what are the differences between the two species of sandhill cranes? She was unaware that there were multiples, and then a follow-up on where the kestrel box is located and whether it was used or not. So who'd like to address that?
I can address it. Firstly, the first part of your question, I love the chat box because I can actually see it. So the two subspecies, you have Tabita, which is the northern migratory species of sandhill crane. They gather in the north of a nation, I think it's Idaho or somewhere, huge numbers of cranes, and they spend their winters here. However, in the summer, we only have the Pratensis, the summer subspecies, the Florida subspecies. And any birds breeding here are the Florida subspecies. And there are only 4,000 to 5,000 of them left, which is why they're endangered, or pairs of them left. I forget whether it's individuals or pairs. And as anyone who's noticed how threatened they are, so many of them are killed on the roads every year. They don't move fast. Often motorists are not slowing down to be careful for them. So they are truly at risk. But it is very hard to tell the difference between them. In general, the Pratensis, the Florida subspecies, are smaller. But as Caitlin pointed out in her presentation, it's very hard to tell the difference, that size difference, unless you see them side by side. So that is them. And the kestrel, we have 2 kestrel boxes in the park, but they are not near the blind. The boxes you see near the blind are duck boxes, and they are in the water. We have additionally an eastern bluebird box in the corral. That's very small, but the kestrel boxes are up much higher, and they are further away. Actually, I don't think, is Ken Landry on? Mike, you can also address the kestrel boxes if they have been checked recently to see if they have been used.
We have 3 in the park, and they're in areas that where we think would be better habitat for the kestrel, since they're prey on small bugs and small mammals like lizards and stuff like that. They're about just slightly bigger than a robin or a blue jay, about the size of a crow. They're not a big bird. And there's a box out by the pump house. There's a one across further east, across from the cabins. And then the last one is out on the bike trail. If you've been out that way, it's out about a mile or so, something like that. Not too far out. And no, we have not checked them yet this year to see whether or not we had any activity. Nothing has been observed.
Hopefully those will get used. Now, we had a follow-up question from C-Day about the duck boxes, whether they're used or not. So, Christine?
They are quite challenging because they are actually in water right now. So actually checking them would be rather hard. I will say that we did notice black-bellied whistling ducks showing a great deal of interest in them last year, sitting on them. So they were using them for perching at the very least. But I have not this year observed birds going in and out. We have 4 boxes. 2 of them are fairly easily visible from the blind. The other 2 are actually a long way around, and you'd have to go around to visit those. So I have to say unsure on that one. We need to do maintenance on them when water levels are at their very lowest.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, just kind of an observation on the study. So maybe Caitlin and anybody else that wants to take this. I know the wood stork and the spoonbill observation numbers were quite low, as we would expect them to be. But from what I could see, it looked like both of them were more prevalent in the spring and the summer, which by the water graph also looks like when the water levels were very low. And I know that they forage and require high concentration, so that might make sense. The little blue heron and tricolor herons were higher in the fall and summer. So I was wondering, I know the water level was measured off to the side. Do you have any idea how the water level corresponds with shallow foraging area, which is what they actually need? You know, I mean, that's related to the topography of the shore, the near shore, so to speak.
So that was definitely, oh, someone's unmuted here. That was definitely a consideration that I had going into it. And I scoured the GIS programs for any sort of LiDAR data that I could see or any sort of bathymetry. And I did speak to a scientist from the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and she said that although they might not have specific data for the sort of bottom, she said it is very shallow. And if I can find it, if I can stop sharing my screen for a second. There are different staff gauges that are in the lake that are maintained by the Water Management District. Unfortunately, they're only read bi-monthly. So that would not have given us a sort of good comparison for the water depths. But I did find, if it loads, here we go. So I did find that there was a staff gauge that, if you've been out to the blind, there's a deeper staff gauge in the water, but it's still in that sort of northwestern section. And if I share my screen again very quickly, let me see if I can find it. Here. So what I did, and I didn't include this in the presentation, but this was going to be for the report, is that there was the staff gauge that called Starkey B. I did take the measurements for that one that were bi-monthly or bi-weekly and sort of compared it to the trend of the water level that we saw from our smaller staff gauge. And so it reached about around 27.7, 27.6 feet. So unfortunately, that was one of the limitations of the below hydraulic gauge readings, was that we couldn't get an accurate sort of read on them. And also I couldn't include, it had such a big interval between, there was like a foot interval. So that was something to consider. So we tried weighting them as much as we could with the, dividing the averages out by the days. But what I know from Starkey B is that I think it bottoms out at 25.5. So feet. So it's measured in, the water level is measured in feet from the North American vertical datum of 1988. So when these measurements, if you see them 28.5, the 0.5 is tenths of a foot. So it's not measured in feet and inches, it's feet and tenths of a foot. But I can say, based on the fact that Starkey B sort of bottoms out at 25.5, there's a good probably 3 to 4 feet of standing water, maybe a little bit more in certain areas and less in certain areas. And certainly with the vegetation, you can see that the emergent plants, which are the ones that grow inside of the water and then come out of the water, they will be in slightly deeper, and the lilies will be in slightly deeper sections of the water. And then you have the grasses and the sedges, and all of those sort of grassy looking vegetation that will be in these shallower areas. So we did see a lot of the little waders more in the shallower grasses, if that does help.
Thank you. I know that was an extremely difficult question to answer, and yeah, I appreciate that. So we've got, I think you addressed the last question that popped up on the chat room. So we've got 2 more to kind of wrap up. Tracy would like to know, you mentioned the Southeastern American kestrel and then just American kestrel. Was there, what's the reason between, using the different terms? If you could.
So I use the different terms because the season for wintering American kestrels, so the migratory American kestrels that come in from the north and stay in Florida over the winter, generally arrive in late fall and leave around early spring. And that correlated with the sightings, all of the sightings that we saw -1 in May, but that was a flyover. So all of the birds that we saw perching in the trees on the lake were within that time frame where the wintering kestrels would be arriving in Florida. So I couldn't say for certain whether they were the threatened southeastern, the southeastern subspecies, or if they were the northern subspecies. So that's why I just labeled them as American kestrel.
Thank you. Excellent. And then one last question, a good one to wrap up from Peter Day. Caitlin, if you were to do this program again for another year, what changes would you try to make with the resources that we have?
So I would definitely love to have done the study for longer. I know it was very taxing on all of us to wake up before sunrise and drive out to the bird blind, but with the limited amount of data, I have only each season, I only have one sort of snapshot of the data. And it would be very useful if I had multiple seasons to be able to see if in fact that sort of seasonality trend that we might have seen was valid. And also to see for the difference in water depths, there's fluctuations in the rain levels. When I looked at the water level data for the previous years, it was a bit wetter. Unfortunately, with the below hydraulic gauge situation, that was the only gauge that was monitored daily. So I wish that we had a gauge that was a bit deeper, like the Starkey B that I had mentioned, that we could have taken daily, but unfortunately we couldn't really see it with our binoculars very well to accurately record those levels. As far as anything else that I would think about, let me think. I definitely had a lot of hiccups in the beginning trying to iron out some of the procedures and methods that we had to do. I think it would have been nicer if we had, or if I had sort of ironed out all the details before the study. But we had some differences in, I guess, how the monitors did record the birds and the levels. So I would have liked to have sat down maybe with everyone at once and give more standardized version of this is how we need to be doing the study. This is how we need to be doing the procedures, because I did have to go over and audit the database a little bit for the beginning months, because there was some confusion on what was considered just a strict flyover only versus what was considered flying with use, and trying to locate the flyovers on a map versus just saying that they were only flyovers and not locating them. So I tried to sort that out as best I could.
Well, thank you. You did a fantastic job, and science is definitely a process. So we're continually improving things as we go along, and appreciate the job that you did on this. So I think we are out of time, and I'd like to invite the rest of the panel members if they have any closing statements they'd like to make. Otherwise, just turn it over to Christine to close out the meeting.
I would just as well. So any of the panel members, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we move on? I wanted to just invite Kristen Kosick, who's here from the Conservation Leadership Initiative, to see if she would like to say a few words. She's not picking up.
Hi, no,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, first of all, congratulations to Caitlin and, everyone else that was involved in this project. I am so just proud of the work that's been put into it and the collaboration that's happened. The intent of my program is to get young people involved in what Audubon is doing. And I think that this is just kind of the gold standard of our vision of the program. So thank you all so much for the work that you've done. And thanks for inviting me to be here too. This was great.
Thank you, Kristen. And it just remains for me to say that on behalf of Audubon and all of us here, thank you to Kristen. We have a check in the mail for you, to a stipend to thank you for everything you have done. We really appreciate your efforts. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you. Congratulations. You can take a huge sigh of relief.
Thank you so much. I mean, I still have that report to write, but yes, this was a big thing coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wanted to say anything else? In that case, I'll just thank you all so much for listening. It was great. Do email us if you have any additional questions, any of the specifics. I hope I saw some things in the chat. Oh, great. Okay, so if there's anything else that you had more detailed questions about the kestrels or the cranes, do just email me. I'm happy to answer away. So thank you so much to everyone, and look forward to seeing you hopefully next month or in one of the events in the near future.